They sent me alone. That was the first thing I noticed when the transport shuttle doors opened, and the docking bay of the Velitheri Orbital Palace stretched out before me, in all its ridiculous grandeur. 12 diplomats were supposed to be standing here. 12 trained negotiators with backgrounds in xenopolitics, trade law, and interstellar arbitration. Instead, there was just me, wearing a gray diplomatic jacket that didn't fit properly across the shoulders, carrying a single case, and stepping onto a floor made of something that looked like polished obsidian but hummed faintly under my boots like a living thing. The docking bay was enormous. Cathedral ceilings rose 40 meters overhead, laced with bioluminescent veins that pulsed in slow rhythms of violet and gold. Every surface was designed to make visitors feel small. It worked. I felt small. But I had felt small in worse places than this, and those places had been trying to kill me at the time, so I kept walking. 6 Velithari guards flanked the walkway. Each one stood over 7 feet tall, encased in ceremonial armor that glowed with shifting patterns of light along the chest plates and shoulder ridges. 4 arms. Every single one of them had 4 arms, each pair moving with independent coordination that made my brain itch if I watched too closely. Their faces were narrow, angular, with skin that shifted between deep indigo and pale silver depending on the light. Beautiful, in the way that a blade is beautiful. You admire it right up until it opens you. A 7th Velithari waited at the end of the walkway, shorter than the guards, no armor. He wore flowing robes of deep crimson and carried a staff topped with a crystal that flickered with inner light, an attaché, low-ranking, based on the single band of metal around his upper left wrist. His name, I would learn, was Dravan, and he looked at me the way someone looks at a stain on an expensive rug. "You are the human delegation," he said, not a question. "I am." His upper eyes, the smaller pair set above the main ones, narrowed. "We were informed there would be 12. Budget cuts." He stared at me for a long moment, then turned without another word and began walking. I followed. The guards fell in behind us, their footsteps perfectly synchronized in a way that felt rehearsed over centuries. I cataloged everything as we moved: the corridor widths, the placement of doorways, the distance between guard posts, the way the bioluminescent veins in the walls brightened when we approached and dimmed after we passed, which meant they were reactive, which meant they were part of a monitoring system. I noted the slight asymmetry in the corridor layout that suggested a hidden passage behind the eastern wall. I counted steps between intersections. None of this was conscious decision. It was just how my mind worked, the same way some people hum without realizing it. Dravan did not attempt conversation, and I did not force it. The silence between us was a communication of its own, thick with his certainty that I was wasting everyone's time and my own quiet understanding that he might be right, but probably was not. The Velithari ascendancy had controlled this region of space for 11,000 years. Their civilization was built on a single principle that governed everything from their politics to their architecture to their interpersonal relationships. The strong decide and the weak accept. But strength, in Velithari culture, was not measured purely in physical power. It was measured in something they called the Kalith, which translated roughly as the art of total contest. Combat, strategy, resource control, adaptability, all woven together into a system so complex that their children began studying it before they could walk. Every political dispute in the ascendancy could be settled through a Kalith trial. Trade agreements, territorial boundaries, succession rights, criminal sentencing. If one party invoked a trial, the other had 2 choices: accept and compete, or refuse and forfeit their position entirely. There was no third option. There was no appeals process. There was no court of last resort where you could argue that the trial was unfair or the conditions were biased. The trial decided, and the decision was absolute. It had been this way for longer than humanity had possessed written language. I had been reading about the Kalith trials for 11 years. I had studied every publicly available match recording. I had obtained, through channels I preferred not to discuss, several hundred recordings that were not publicly available. I had mapped the tactical evolution of the trial system across 3,000 years of recorded history, identifying 17 distinct doctrinal shifts and the competitive pressures that had produced them. I had built predictive models of arena behavior based on match data, going back further than most Velithari scholars bothered to look. None of this had been assigned to me. None of it had been requested by my superiors. It was simply what I did, the way a river simply follows the path of least resistance. My mind encountered a system, and it needed to understand it, completely, exhaustively, obsessively. Dravan led me through a set of doors that were 3 times my height and opened without sound. The imperial court of the Velithari ascendancy spread out before me like a scene from a fever dream. The chamber was circular, nearly 200 meters across, with tiered seating that rose in concentric rings toward a domed ceiling where artificial stars drifted in slow orbits. Hundreds of Velithari occupied those seats, draped in silks and armor and crystalline jewelry that caught the starlight and scattered it in fractured rainbows. The air smelled like ozone and something floral that I could not identify, sweet and slightly metallic, like copper wrapped in jasmine. At the center of the chamber, on a raised platform of white stone, sat the Empress. Sarathai of the Velithari was ancient by any species standards. Her skin had shifted permanently to a deep, almost black indigo, and the bioluminescent patterns that traced her cheekbones and temples glowed with a steady, unwavering light that younger Velithari could not achieve. She wore no armor, no jewelry, nothing but a simple robe of pale silver. She did not need ornament. The way every being in that chamber oriented toward her, the way conversations died when she shifted in her seat, said everything about what she was. Power that no longer needed to announce itself. Beside her, standing rather than seated, was Princess Vielith. I had studied her file extensively. Heir apparent to the ascendancy, 147 years old, which made her young by Velithari standards, barely past what they considered adolescence. She was tall even for her species, with skin that shifted rapidly between silver and pale blue, in patterns I recognized as emotional signaling, though most humans would not have noticed. She wore light combat armor, matte black with no ornamentation except a single crimson stripe down the left side that marked her as a trial champion. The youngest champion in 3 centuries. 41 matches fought, 41 victories, 0 defeats. She watched me approach the platform with an expression I had seen many times in my career, on many different faces, belonging to many different species. Mild curiosity sharpened by the absolute certainty that I was not worth her time. I stopped at the prescribed distance from the platform, exactly 9 paces, and inclined my head in the formal Velithari greeting of a visitor to a superior court. Not a bow. The Velithari despised bowing, a precise 15-degree inclination held for exactly 2 seconds. I had practiced it on the shuttle until my neck ached. Empress Sarathai, I said. I bring greetings from the Terran Coalition and a formal request to renegotiate the terms of the Velaran Resource Accord. The Empress looked at me, the way one might look at an insect that had crawled onto a dining table. Not with hostility. With the faint, distant consideration of whether to brush it aside now or wait until it became annoying. The Terran Coalition sends 1 representative, she said. Her voice was low and resonant, and the translation implant in my ear struggled slightly with the harmonic undertones. For a treaty negotiation involving 3 star systems and 47 resource extraction sites. I am sufficient, I said. A ripple of amusement moved through the court. I heard it in the shifting of fabric, the quiet clicking sounds that Velithari made with their secondary jaw plates when they found something entertaining. Violeth's skin flickered to a brighter silver for a moment. Amusement, definitely. I presented Earth's position. I laid it out clearly, precisely, using the formal diplomatic structure that the Velithari respected. I cited the original treaty terms, the extraction quotas, the shared development clauses, and the 17 specific violations the Ascendancy had committed over the past decade. I was thorough. I was accurate. I was, if I could say so objectively, excellent. The Empress dismissed it in under 3 minutes. The Velaran Accord was drafted when your species had barely learned to leave its own atmosphere, she said. The terms reflected the charity of a superior civilization, extending resources to a fledgling neighbor. That charity has expired. The Ascendancy will manage its own resources without obligation to a species that cannot even send a proper delegation to defend its interests. I opened my mouth to counter. Princess Violet stepped forward. The court went quiet instantly. Not the gradual settling of conversation, but a hard, immediate silence, the kind that happens when everyone in a room recognizes that something significant is about to occur. "I invoke the Caliph," Violet said. Her voice was clear and carried effortlessly across the chamber. She was looking directly at me, and for the first time I saw something beyond casual dismissal in her expression. There was eagerness there. Hunger, even. She was a champion who had not been truly challenged in years, and even a weak opponent was better than no opponent at all. "I offer formal trial on behalf of the Ascendancy. If I prevail, the Valoran Accord is dissolved permanently, and all associated resources revert to Velithari control. If Earth's champion prevails, the Accord is renewed on Earth's terms for 100 standard cycles." She paused, and something like a smile crossed her angular features. "Earth may send its champion at its convenience. We will wait." The court murmured with approval. This was how things were supposed to work. Clean, decisive. A trial would settle in hours, what diplomats might argue about for years. "I have questions about the trial format," I said. Violet looked at me with barely concealed patience. "The Caliph trial consists of 5 rounds. Positioning, pursuit and evasion, direct combat, siege architecture, and the Unbound, which combines all elements without restriction. The arena is the Kytheri sphere, a reconfigurable combat environment housed within the hollow core of this station's secondary moon. Each round tests a different capability, and points are accumulated across all 5. The competitor with the highest aggregate score at the conclusion of the 5th round is declared the victor." She tilted her head slightly. "I trust your coalition has warriors capable of understanding this." "Thank you for the explanation," I said. "I accept." Silence. "You accept," Violet repeated. "I will serve as Earth's champion, myself, tomorrow, if the schedule permits." I had heard Velithari laughter before, in recordings, during my years of study. It was a complex sound, layered harmonics produced by both the primary and secondary vocal structures. In small doses it was almost musical, produced by several hundred Velithari simultaneously. In a chamber designed for acoustic projection, it was overwhelming. It hit me like a physical force, vibrations I could feel in my chest and teeth. Violet did not laugh. She stared at me, and her skin shifted through a rapid sequence of colors that I could not fully interpret. Surprise, certainly, confusion, and beneath both of those, something that might have been pity. She stepped closer to the edge of the platform and looked down at me. "You will lose, human," she said quietly, almost gently, the way you might warn a child not to touch a hot surface. There was no cruelty in it. She genuinely believed she was doing me a kindness by stating the obvious. I met her eyes, all 4 of them, the main pair and the smaller secondary pair above. I held the gaze for exactly long enough to make it clear that I had heard her and understood her, and was not going to change my mind. Then I nodded once, just once. Drevon escorted me to the guest quarters. The laughter followed us down the corridor, fading slowly like a storm moving into the distance. Drevon did not speak. He did not need to. His contempt was a physical presence between us, as tangible as the humming floor beneath our feet. The guest quarters were lavish by any standard. The Velithari did not skimp on hospitality, even for visitors they considered beneath them. The room was large, climate-controlled to human preferences, with a sleeping platform that adjusted to my body weight, and a viewing window that looked out onto the pale surface of the moon below. I locked the door. I checked the room for surveillance devices. I found 3, disabled 2, and left the 3rd active with its visual feed blocked, but its audio feed intact. Let them listen. They would hear nothing useful. I sat on the edge of the sleeping platform and opened my case. There were no weapons inside, no armor, No technology of any kind that would help in a physical contest. There was a change of clothes, a water flask, a nutrient bar, and a notebook. The notebook was old. The cover was worn soft from years of handling, and the spine was cracked in 3 places from being opened and closed thousands of times. Every page was filled with my handwriting, dense and small, annotated with diagrams and calculations and tactical notations in a shorthand system I had developed myself because no existing system was detailed enough for what I needed to record. I opened it to the last section. The page was divided into a grid. At the top, in careful lettering, were the words, "Opponents of Consequence." Below that was a list of names. Some were human, most were not. Each name had a species designation, a tactical profile summary, and a date. Every single name had been crossed out with a single clean line. Every name except the last one. Vylith Velithari, adaptive polyform combatant, undefeated Kalith champion. Youngest in 3 centuries. Her name was not crossed out. I studied the page for a long time. Then I closed the notebook, placed it on the platform beside me, and began to prepare for tomorrow. The shuttle that carried me to the Catheri sphere departed at dawn, or what passed for dawn, on an orbital station that manufactured its own light cycles. I rode alone in a transport designed for 12, strapped into a seat that was too large for a human frame, watching through the viewport as the station's secondary moon grew from a distant marble to a looming presence that filled the entire window. The moon was hollow. I knew this from my research, but knowing it intellectually, and seeing the massive entrance aperture sliding open in the moon's surface to swallow the shuttle whole, were 2 very different experiences. The shuttle descended through a shaft carved from solid rock, lit by bioluminescent strips that blurred past like tracer fire, and then the shaft opened into a space so vast that my mind refused to properly process it for several seconds. The Catheri sphere. The arena was a floating platform suspended in the exact center of the hollowed moon, nearly a kilometer across, constructed from modular sections that could reconfigure during combat. The platform floated in a gravity field, generated by emitters embedded in the moon's inner surface, which meant the gravity could be altered, redirected, or eliminated entirely in specific zones at any time. The terrain on the platform was a complex landscape of elevated sections, depressions, corridors, open plazas, and obstacle clusters, all designed to shift and change as the rounds progressed. Surrounding the platform, carved into the inner surface of the moon itself, were observation galleries, thousands of seats arranged in concentric rings, every single one of them occupied. I had expected a crowd. I had not expected this. The entire court had come. Military officers, politicians, merchants, scholars, common citizens who had traveled from across the system. This was not just a contest. This was entertainment. A princess against a lone human. They had come to watch Vylith demonstrate the superiority of the ascendancy against the youngest spacefaring civilization in the sector. The shuttle docked at the competitor's entrance on the eastern side of the platform. I stepped out into a preparation chamber where a Velithari official waited with a ceremonial sash and a set of light combat armor sized for a human frame. "Your armor," the official said, extending all 4 arms in a display that was meant to convey formal respect, but mostly conveyed impatience. "No thank you. The armor is provided for your protection. The trial includes direct combat rounds." "I understand. No armor." The official stared at me. I was wearing the same gray diplomatic jacket I had worn the day before, plain trousers, and standard-issue boots that were designed for comfort rather than combat. I looked like a mid-level bureaucrat who had wandered into the wrong building. "As you wish," the official said, and led me to the arena floor. I walked out onto the platform and the sound hit me first, not cheering. The Velithari did not cheer like humans did. It was a harmonic resonance, thousands of voices producing a layered tone that communicated collective attention. Every eye in those galleries was locked on the 2 figures now standing at opposite ends of the arena floor. Vylith stood on the western platform. She had traded her matte black armor for full trial configuration, a lighter, more flexible version that allowed unrestricted movement of all 4 arms, while still providing protection at critical points. She held no weapons yet. Those would come in later rounds. She stood perfectly still, her skin shifting in slow, controlled patterns of deep blue and silver that indicated focus and readiness. I stood on the eastern platform. No armor, no weapons, gray jacket. The harmonic tone from the galleries shifted. Confusion, I interpreted. They were not sure what to make of me. From this distance, I probably looked like a mistake. The arena's adjudication system activated. A deep, resonant tone filled the sphere, and a holographic display materialized above the center of the arena, visible from every gallery seat, showing the score at 0 for both competitors. The display also showed the round designation, Round 1, Positioning. The rules appeared in both Velithari script and Terran standard on the display. The arena floor was divided into a grid of interconnected zones. Each zone contained a node, a physical structure that could be claimed by touching it and holding position for 5 seconds. Claimed nodes earned points every 30 seconds for as long as they were held. The terrain would shift every 90 seconds, reconfiguring the zones, and potentially making some nodes inaccessible or changing their point values. No direct combat was permitted in this round, purely tactical movement and resource denial. The starting tone sounded. Violet moved like liquid silver. She crossed the first 3 zones in seconds, her 4 arms interacting with terrain elements, to vault obstacles and change direction with a fluidity that was breathtaking to watch. She claimed the first node before I had crossed 2 zones, and the second node 5 seconds later, and the third node 4 seconds after that. Her strategy was immediately recognizable to me, the Tesserend sweep, a classic opening doctrine that prioritized rapid node acquisition across the widest possible front. It had been developed by General Tesserend over 300 years ago and had remained unbeaten because it exploited the fundamental architecture of the arena grid in a way that no counter-strategy had successfully addressed. No Velithari counter-strategy, anyway. I stopped running. I had claimed no nodes. Violet was already holding 3 of the 7 primary nodes and was moving toward a 4th. The commentators broadcasting to the galleries were probably describing my pause as confusion, maybe panic, maybe the dawning realization that I was catastrophically outmatched. I looked at the grid. I looked at the terrain. I looked at the pattern of bioluminescent markers embedded in the arena floor that indicated where the next terrain shift would reconfigure the landscape. Most competitors could not read those markers. The shift pattern was supposed to be unpredictable, but it was not unpredictable. It was algorithmic, based on a mathematical progression that the Velithari had developed millennia ago and had never bothered to change because no one had ever cracked it during a live match. I had cracked it on paper, 4 years ago, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in my apartment on Earth, working from recordings of historical trial matches that I had obtained through channels I preferred not to discuss. I moved, not fast, deliberately, carefully, with purpose. I claimed a node on the far southern edge of the grid, one that the commentators would have ranked as the least valuable position on the board. I held it. Then I moved to a second node, adjacent to the first, equally unimpressive. Then a third, forming a small triangle of claimed positions that looked, by every conventional metric, pathetic. The scoreboard showed Violet leading by a commanding margin. The galleries hummed with what I recognized as Velithari satisfaction, the sound of expectations being confirmed. The terrain shifted. The reconfiguration was massive. Entire sections of the grid dropped away or rose to new heights. Corridors sealed, new pathways opened. The gravity in several zones fluctuated, creating areas where movement became difficult or impossible. The 3 nodes I held, the worthless ones, the ones that any competent Velithari strategist would have ignored, became the only stable ground on the southern half of the grid. Every node around them shifted, destabilized, or became temporarily inaccessible. 2 of Violet's 4 claimed nodes were suddenly on unstable terrain, and the point values of her remaining positions dropped as the grid recalculated. She had to abandon them. She had no choice. The terrain beneath those nodes was literally crumbling, and the arena's safety systems would deactivate a node rather than let a competitor be injured by collapsing infrastructure. I watched her reposition. She was fast, brilliant, adaptive. She recovered 2 new nodes within 40 seconds, which was extraordinary by any standard. But the damage was done. My seemingly worthless positions were now generating maximum points, and the gap between our scores was closing with every passing second. Round 1 ended with me holding a slight lead. Not commanding, not dramatic, just enough. The galleries had gone quiet, not the amused silence of a crowd watching a foregone conclusion. A different kind of quiet, the kind that happens when several thousand people simultaneously realize that something they were certain about might be wrong. Violith crossed the arena floor during the interval between rounds. Her skin was cycling through colors more rapidly than I had seen before, a sign of emotional processing that she was not fully controlling. She stopped 2 meters from me and looked down. She was nearly a foot taller than me, and the height difference felt larger in the open arena, with thousands of eyes watching. "Where did you learn Velithari tactical theory?" she asked. "I did not learn Velithari tactical theory," I said. Her secondary eyes narrowed. "You read the terrain shift pattern. No competitor has ever done that during a live match. That requires deep knowledge of the algorithmic foundations of the Kytheri system." I did not learn the algorithm from Velithari sources. I learned pattern recognition in a place called the Western Pacific, reading ocean currents to predict where fish would be. She stared at me. The reference meant nothing to her. An ocean was an abstract concept to a species that had evolved on a world of crystalline plateaus and thin atmosphere. Fishing was not a word in her vocabulary. My entire frame of reference was so alien to hers that the explanation was functionally useless, and she knew it, and that frustrated her more than anything that had happened on the arena floor. She turned and walked back to her starting position without another word. Her skin had settled into a deep, steady blue. Concentration. She was recalibrating, abandoning her assumptions about me, and building a new model from scratch. I watched her go, and felt the first quiet stirring of something that I had not expected to feel today: professional interest. Round 2. Pursuit and evasion. The rules were simple. One competitor would be designated the hunter. The other would evade. After a set time period, the roles would switch. Points were awarded based on capture time or survival time. Violith was designated first hunter. The starting tone sounded and I ran. Not the way the Velithari expected prey to run. Not in straight lines seeking distance. I dropped to the ground and rolled through a maintenance access gap in the arena floor that was exactly 23 centimeters tall, a space that a Velithari could never fit through because their shoulder structure was too broad. I emerged in a lower service corridor that ran beneath the main arena surface, a space that was technically part of the arena, but that no competitor had ever used, because Velithari bodies simply did not fit. I moved through the subfloor corridors in a crouch, using the grating above to track Violeth's position by the sound of her footsteps. She was searching methodically, using the classic Velithari hunt pattern, a spiral that tightened toward the last known position of the quarry. Textbook. Beautiful. Completely ineffective against someone who was not on the same level of the arena. I emerged from a different access point, 50 meters from where I had entered. I stripped the sleeve off my gray jacket, tore it into 3 pieces, and left them at deliberate intervals along a corridor that led away from my actual position. Scent markers. The Velithari had a secondary olfactory system in their lower jaw plates that could detect trace chemical signatures. The fabric from my jacket would register as recent human presence and draw her pursuit in the wrong direction. Then I moved to a gravity shift zone near the arena's northern edge. The gravity in this zone fluctuated between normal and nearly zero in 8-second cycles. I timed the cycles, waited for the near-zero phase, and used the momentum to launch myself upward onto a terrain feature that was not accessible by conventional climbing. I was breathing hard and my arms were shaking from the effort, but I settled into position and waited. Violeth found the jacket sleeve fragments. She paused, analyzed them, and recognized the deception in about 6 seconds. Impressive. She abandoned the false trail and began a new search pattern, faster this time, more aggressive, using her 4 arms to move through the terrain at a speed that should have been terrifying. She covered ground with a fluid, relentless efficiency that would have caught any opponent who relied on running alone. She did not find me. The timer expired. I had survived the full duration. The roles reversed. Now, I was the hunter. I did not search. I did not pursue. Pursuit was a strategy designed for predators with superior speed and endurance, and I was inferior to Violet in both categories. Instead, I thought, she would expect me to follow a search pattern. She would position herself to exploit that pattern, staying ahead of my sweep, using her speed to maintain distance. The Velethari evasion doctrine was built on the assumption that hunters hunted. They searched, they pursued, they moved with purpose through the terrain, covering ground, checking positions, closing in on the prey through systematic elimination of hiding spots. The entire defensive strategy was designed to counter active pursuit. So I did not pursue. I stood in the center of the arena, closed my eyes for 4 seconds, and thought about everything I knew. Her movement patterns from round 1, her preferred directional tendencies, the way she favored her left side when changing direction quickly, a slight bias that I had noticed during her node-claiming runs. The terrain configuration in this round, which I had already mapped, the locations that offered the best combination of concealment and escape routes for someone with her physical capabilities. The spots that matched not just what she could use, but what she would instinctively gravitate toward, because instinct was pattern, and pattern was readable. I opened my eyes and walked, not ran, walked, directly to a narrow corridor between 2 elevated terrain features on the arena's western edge. I sat down on a low ledge, folded my hands, and waited. 3 minutes and 47 seconds later, Violet rounded the corner at speed, and found me sitting there. She stopped so abruptly that her boots scraped the arena surface. Her skin flashed white, which in Velethari emotional signaling meant genuine shock. She stared at me. I looked up at her from my seated position. "How?" she said. "You favor your left side. The western corridor has the best left-handed escape routes. This was the logical place for you to pass through." The galleries were absolutely silent. I could hear the hum of the gravity emitters in the walls. I could hear Violet breathing, a sound like wind through crystal. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and slow, the way it always got when something I had calculated turned out to be right. Total capture time, 3 minutes, 47 seconds. The fastest capture in the history of this round format. The score updated. I was leading, not by much, but the lead was real, and it was growing. During the interval, I saw movement in the observation galleries. A Velethari in a general's uniform, his armor heavy with campaign markers and rank insignia, was pushing through the crowd toward the Empress's viewing box. He was holding a datapad, and even from this distance I could see the urgency in his movements. He was not watching the match. He was reading something on that screen, and whatever it said had changed the color of his skin from a controlled indigo to a pale, almost gray tone that I recognized as Velethari alarm. Violet approached me again. Her demeanor had shifted further. The patronizing amusement was completely gone. In its place was something sharper, more focused. The expression of someone who had just realized that the ground beneath their feet was not as solid as they had assumed. "Tell me your name," she said. "Not your diplomatic title. Your name." "Elias Vane," I said. The name meant nothing to her. She searched my face for something, did not find it, and returned to her starting position. In the observation gallery, the general had reached the Empress's viewing box. He leaned close to Sarathai and held out the datapad. The Empress glanced at the screen. Her skin went still, completely still. No shifting, no cycling, no color change at all. In Velethari physiology, that meant one thing. Every emotional response was being suppressed simultaneously, which only happened when the emotional input was too significant to process publicly. She looked up from the datapad and found me across the vast distance of the arena. Our eyes met. Even from hundreds of meters away, I recognized the expression that crossed her face. Reassessment. Round 3. Direct combat. The weapons racks deployed from recessed panels on both sides of the arena. The selection was extensive. Resonance blades, impact staffs, kinetic whips, gravity hammers, a dozen other instruments designed for Velethari physiology and fighting styles. All were calibrated to non-lethal settings. The arena's safety systems would intervene if a strike exceeded injury thresholds, but non-lethal did not mean painless. These weapons could crack bone, tear muscle, and send shockwaves through the nervous system that would leave an arm numb for hours. They would hurt. They were designed to hurt. Violith selected a resonance blade. It was a weapon that required 4 arms to wield at its full capability, a long, curved instrument that generated a localized vibration field along its edge. In 2 hands it was a sword, in 4 hands it became something else entirely, a weapon that could attack and defend simultaneously from multiple angles, creating overlapping strike patterns that were nearly impossible for a 2-armed opponent to counter. She had used it in every one of her 41 victories. It was not just her weapon of choice. It was an extension of her body, and she moved with it the way a river moves with its current. I walked along the weapons rack. I examined several options without touching them. The gravity hammer was too heavy for sustained use. The kinetic whip required a fighting style I had not practiced in years. The impact staff was tempting, but would not survive sustained contact with a resonance blade's vibration field. I picked up a short training rod, a blunt cylinder about the length of my forearm, made of dense composite material. It was the simplest object on the rack. It was designed for warm-up exercises, not actual combat. The galleries stirred. Violet's skin rippled with a color I had not seen from her before, a deep amber that might have been concern or might have been insult. Either way, it told me she was off balance, and any opponent off balance was an opponent giving away information. "Choose a real weapon," she said. "This is fine." The combat tone sounded. Violet came at me with everything she had, and everything she had was extraordinary. 4 arms moving in independent attack patterns, the resonance blade singing through the air in arcs that overlapped and intersected, creating a web of strikes that approached from multiple vectors simultaneously, high, low, left, right, with the secondary arms filling every gap that the primary arms left open. She was fast, precise, and powerful, and she fought with the confidence of someone who had never lost. I did not try to match her speed. I did not try to match her strength. I did not try to block the resonance blade with my training rod, because the vibration field would have torn it from my grip and probably broken my wrist in the process. Instead, I moved. Just enough. Always just enough. A step to the right that put me 3 centimeters outside the blade's arc. A lean backward that let the upper strike pass over my face, close enough that I felt the displaced air on my skin. A pivot that turned my body edge-on, reducing my target profile by half. Every dodge was calculated to the minimum distance required, not an inch more. I was not fighting her. I was reading her. There was a rhythm to her attacks, as there was to every fighter's attacks, no matter how skilled. The forearm technique created complexity, but complexity was pattern, and pattern was predictable once you understood the underlying structure. Her primary arms led each combination. Her secondary arms followed at a fixed interval, approximately 0.3 seconds behind, providing the follow-up strikes that caught opponents who dodged the initial attack. The recovery time on her 4th arm, the lower left, was fractionally longer than the others, maybe a 1/10 of a second, almost certainly due to a minor joint issue that she had compensated for so thoroughly that no Velethari opponent had ever noticed. I noticed. The way I angled my body came from years of training that I did not name in my conscious thoughts. It lived in my muscles, in the automatic calculations that happened below the level of awareness. Centerline, economy of motion. Let them commit. These were not Velethari principles. They were not principles from any alien combat tradition. They were something older and simpler, refined over generations of humans fighting other humans, adapted and evolved and passed down until they became instinct. She landed a hit. Her blade caught my left shoulder, and even at non-lethal calibration, the vibration field sent a shock of pain through my entire arm that made my fingers go numb for 2 seconds. The crowd reacted, that layered harmonic tone surging with approval. First blood, metaphorically speaking. But I had let her land it. Not consciously, not deliberately in the sense that I had planned to take the hit, but some part of me, the part that processed combat information below the level of conscious thought, had recognized that this specific strike pattern was one I needed to see completed to understand her timing on the 4th arm recovery. The hit was the price of information, and information was worth more than comfort. She attacked again. The same 4-arm pattern, refined and faster, the resonance blade weaving a cage of vibrating metal around me. I watched her shoulders this time, not the blade. The blade was a distraction. The shoulders told the truth. They told me where the force was coming from, where the commitment was, where the recovery would be. On the third strike of the combination, when her primary arms were fully extended, and her secondary arms were in the follow-up phase, and her lower left arm was in that fractionally delayed recovery, I stepped inside her reach. Inside was the one place the resonance blade could not function. The weapon was designed for mid-range combat, and at close quarters, the length of the blade became a liability. She could not bring it to bear without risking striking herself, and the vibration field destabilized at distances less than half a meter from the wielder. I was inside that distance. I was close enough to see the individual scales of color shifting on her skin, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her body, which was higher than a human's by several degrees, close enough to see her secondary eyes widen with surprise, the pupils contracting in a way that told me she had never had an opponent this close during a trial. I struck 3 times with the training rod, 3 precise hits to nerve clusters on her primary right arms, targeting the junction points where the major neural pathways crossed beneath the surface. These targets were not in any human combat manual. I had learned their locations from Velithari medical texts that I had spent 2 years obtaining and 3 more years studying, cross-referencing anatomical diagrams with combat footage to identify the exact surface positions where a blunt strike would produce temporary neural disruption. Her right side went partially numb. The resonance blade dipped. For 6 seconds, she fought with 2.5 functioning arms instead of 4. She adapted. In 6 seconds, she shifted to a 2-arm defensive style that most Velithari warriors spent years learning, and she executed it flawlessly under combat pressure, on the fly, without hesitation. I had expected her to need at least 10 seconds to adjust. She needed 6. 6 seconds to completely restructure her combat approach and implement a fighting style she had probably only practiced in training sessions. That was when I understood that Princess Violet was not merely talented. She was something rarer than talent. She was adaptive in a way that I had encountered only a handful of times in my entire career, and never to this degree. We traded strikes. I took hits. Of course I took hits. She was faster, stronger, had twice the limbs, and was fighting with a superior weapon. My left side ached from the shoulder strike. My ribs protested every twist and pivot. My breathing was harder than I wanted it to be. But every exchange taught me something, and every lesson was applied within seconds. I learned her breathing pattern, which told me when she was about to change tempo. I learned her footwork bias, which told me where she would move before she moved. I learned the micro-expressions that preceded her feints, a slight tightening around her secondary eyes that she probably did not know she had. And she was learning me. That was the part that made this different from every other fight I had been in. She was watching my dodges and calculating the minimum distances I used. She was narrowing her strike arcs to give me less room to move. She was adjusting her timing to close the gaps I exploited. She was not just executing her training, she was evolving her approach in real time, incorporating data from our exchange into her strategy on the fly. Every time I found an opening, she closed it 2 exchanges later. Every time I exploited a pattern, she changed the pattern. Round 3 ended. The score was close. I was still leading, but by a margin so thin that a single strong performance in either remaining round could reverse it entirely. In the galleries, the general sat beside the Empress. He had shown her the datapad. Whatever conversation had passed between them was finished, and now Sarathai sat absolutely still, watching me with an intensity that I could feel across the distance like pressure on my skin. Violith returned to her starting position. She moved differently now. The casual confidence of the opening rounds was gone, replaced by something more controlled, more deliberate, more dangerous. She was not afraid of me. I doubted she was afraid of anything, but she was treating me differently than she had treated any of her 41 previous opponents. She was treating me like a problem that required her full capabilities, and the sight of that focus settling onto her features was both flattering and deeply concerning. Round 4. Siege Architecture. The arena reconfigured entirely. The combat terrain retracted and was replaced by 2 separate building zones, each equipped with modular construction elements, defensive barriers, energy emitters, and tactical resources. The objective was dual: build and defend a tactical position while simultaneously attacking and dismantling the opponent's position. No direct physical contact. Purely strategic, purely intellectual. This was the round that tested the mind more than the body, and I needed it, because my body was starting to remind me that it was human, and therefore had limits that the Velithari did not share. Violith built a masterpiece. Her defensive position was a classic Velithari matrix, layered concentric barriers with overlapping fields of coverage, each layer supporting the ones adjacent to it, the entire structure forming a self-reinforcing geometric pattern that was as beautiful as it was functional. It had no obvious weak points. Every approach vector was covered. Every potential breach point was backed by a secondary defense. The energy distribution was optimized across all layers, so that attacking any single point would draw resources from adjacent sections to reinforce the targeted area. It was textbook perfection, the culmination of 11,000 years of Velithari military engineering theory, and she built it in minutes, with the ease of someone assembling something they had practiced 1,000 times. I built something ugly. My structure was asymmetric, irregular, with walls at odd angles and barriers placed in positions that seemed random. There were obvious weak points, gaps in coverage that any first-year military student could identify, positions where a concentrated assault would clearly break through. The energy distribution was uneven, with some sections drawing far more power than they appeared to need, and others left almost unprotected. It looked like the work of someone who did not understand the basic principles of defensive construction. Violith targeted those weak points. They were practically invitations. The first breach triggered a cascading reconfiguration. The wall she had broken through collapsed inward, but as it fell, it redirected the energy from her attack into a series of counterweight mechanisms that shifted 3 other sections of my structure into new positions. The gap she had created sealed itself from the inside, the collapsing wall becoming part of a new barrier that was stronger than the original. 2 new defensive layers materialized in locations that were suddenly covering the approach vectors to her own position, turning her own attack energy against her. She had spent resources breaking through a wall that was designed to be broken. Every resource she invested was wasted. Every breach she created made my structure stronger and her position weaker. The energy she used to attack was captured, redirected, and added to my own reserves. She hit the second weak point. The same thing happened. Cascading reconfiguration, wasted resources, improved defenses. This time, the restructuring also launched a counter-assault on her position from an angle she had not anticipated, forcing her to divert defensive resources from her southern perimeter to respond to a threat from the northeast. Violith stopped attacking. She stood in the center of her beautiful, symmetrical, perfectly engineered defensive matrix, and she stared at my ugly, asymmetric, chaotic-looking structure, and I watched the realization move across her face like light across water. Her skin went through a color sequence I had never seen in any reference material, something that started as frustration and passed through confusion and arrived at something that looked almost like wonder. "It gets stronger when it breaks," she said. Not to me, to herself. But the arena acoustics carried it across the distance between us, and I heard every word. Then she did something I had not expected, not even slightly, not in any scenario I had modeled, any possibility I had considered, any prediction I had made. She began dismantling her own position. I stood in the center of my ugly, brilliant structure and watched the most decorated trial champion in 3 centuries voluntarily destroy the most perfect defensive matrix I had ever seen. She pulled it apart piece by piece, not in frustration but with purpose, studying each component as she removed it, understanding how the classical architecture worked and why it failed against an adaptive system. She rebuilt from scratch, and what she built was not Velithari. It was something new. It incorporated principles she had just learned from watching my structure respond to her attacks. Defensive positions that bent rather than broke, weak points that were actually hinges for reconfiguration, traps disguised as vulnerabilities, asymmetric layouts that sacrificed elegance for adaptability, trading the beauty of perfect geometry for the effectiveness of a system that could change its own shape in response to pressure. She was not copying me. She was synthesizing, taking the concept and filtering it through her own understanding, her own instincts, her own 11,000-year-old combat tradition, and producing something that was neither Velithari nor human, but something else entirely, something that belonged to her alone. The round ended in a near draw. I held a razor-thin advantage on points, earned in the early phase before she had adapted. But the quality of what she had built in the final minutes was, I will say this without reservation, superior to anything I could have constructed. She had taken my idea and made it better, in minutes, under competitive pressure, in front of her entire civilization. I sat in my preparation area during the interval, and breathed, and felt something I had not felt during a competitive engagement in a very long time. Respect. Not the distant, analytical respect of a strategist evaluating a capable opponent. Something warmer than that. Something closer to admiration. She had been humiliated, surprised, outmaneuvered, and pushed to the edge of her capabilities. And her response had been to tear down everything she knew and rebuild it better. In real time, under pressure, in front of thousands of her own people. That was not the response of a champion. That was the response of a mind that cared more about getting better than about looking good. Vylith approached me before the final round. Her demeanor had shifted entirely from where it had been at the start. The condescension, the casual superiority, the amused tolerance of an inferior species, all of it was gone. What remained was something I recognized, because I had seen it in my own reflection on the mornings before the hardest engagements of my career. Clarity. Total, absolute, uncompromising clarity. The kind that only comes when you stop worrying about winning and start focusing entirely on performing at the highest level you are capable of reaching. "What are you?" she asked. "Not who, what." "I am a human," I said. "That is all." She shook her head slowly. Her skin was a steady, deep blue, no shifting, no cycling, complete control. "That is not what I mean." "I know," I said. She turned and walked back to her starting position. In the galleries, I saw movement again. The Empress rose from her seat, a gesture that caused every Velithari in sight to immediately fall silent. She did not speak. She simply stood and watched. The general beside her had his hands folded in the formal Velithari posture of grave assessment, all four arms interlocked at the wrists. A chime sounded throughout the sphere. Recess. The Empress had called a formal pause in the trial. 2 guards appeared at my preparation area and escorted me through a service corridor into the interior of the observation structure. The corridor was narrow and cold and completely undecorated, a functional space that visitors were never meant to see. It ended at a door that opened into a private chamber. The Empress was already there. The general stood behind her right shoulder. On the table between us sat a datapad, its screen facing down. "Sit," Sarathai said. I sat. The general reached forward and turned the datapad over. The screen activated, and I saw my own face looking back at me. Not the diplomatic file. Not the carefully sanitized profile that the Terran Coalition had submitted with my credentials. The other file. The one that existed in a classified database 3 security levels above what any foreign intelligence service should have been able to access. "Commander Elias Vane," the general said. His name, I noted from his rank insignia, was Korthon. Terran Defense Force, Strategic Operations Division. Service record, 17 engagements in contested theaters. In every engagement, you were outnumbered, outgunned, and operating without adequate support. In every engagement, you achieved your objective through tactical adaptation and unconventional methodology. He paused, letting each word settle. You designed 3 of the counter-doctrine frameworks currently in use by your species' military. You hold the highest strategic aptitude score ever recorded by the Coalition Assessment Program, a score that the assessors initially rejected as a system error and retested 4 times before accepting the result. I said nothing. "You were removed from active service 4 years ago," Korthon continued, "not because of failure, because your command considered your tactical profile too destabilizing for conventional deployment. They did not know how to use you without disrupting every operation you were attached to. You were placed in the diplomatic corps." He set the datapad down. "This is who we are facing." The Empress looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. There were layers to it, reassessment and calculation, and something that might have been respect, or might have been wariness, or might have been both tangled together in a way that even she could not separate. "Why did Earth send you?" she asked. I considered lying. I considered crafting a strategic narrative about Earth's hidden intentions, its careful planning, its deliberate deployment of its most capable asset. It would have been the smart play. It would have elevated Earth's position and created an impression of calculated strength. But I was tired of lying, and the Empress deserved better. "They did not send me because of who I am," I said. "They sent me because I was the only one available. No one else wanted the assignment. Earth's government did not consider the Velithari Treaty important enough to warrant a full delegation. The budget for this mission was cut 3 times before departure. The team was reduced from 12 to 4 to 1, and the one they sent was the person who happened to be between assignments and could not find a good enough excuse to say no." Silence. Corthon's skin shifted to a dark amber that signaled disbelief. The Empress's expression did not change. "Your species' most dangerous strategist," she said slowly, "was sent to negotiate with the most powerful military civilization in this sector because no one else could be bothered." "Yes." She made a sound that I recognized as Velithari irony, a low harmonic tone from the secondary vocal structure. It was almost a laugh, but not quite. It carried too much weight for humor. "You have studied our combat doctrine," Corthon said. It was not a question. "For 11 years. Why? You had no reason to expect this situation." "I study every species' combat doctrine. It is compulsive. It is how my mind works. I have read more Velithari tactical theory than most Velithari generals. I have mapped the doctrinal evolution of the Kalith system across 3 millennia. I can name every trial champion going back to the 7th Reformation, and I can tell you the specific tactical innovation that each one introduced." I paused. No offense. Corthon's skin went through a rapid sequence of colors that ended in a shade I had not seen before. It might have been grudging acknowledgement. It might have been indigestion. With Velithari, the distinction was sometimes subtle. "I am considering canceling the trial," the Empress said. "Please do not." Her secondary eyes focused on me with sharp intensity. "Explain." "Princess Violet deserves to finish. She is the most adaptive opponent I have ever faced, and I have faced opponents from 9 different species across 3 decades. Stopping now would dishonor what she has accomplished today. What she built in round 4, the synthesis she created by dismantling her own architecture and rebuilding from first principles, that was not the work of a student or a champion. That was the work of a mind that could change the way your entire civilization approaches strategic thinking." I met the Empress's gaze. "She is extraordinary. Let her fight." Sarathai studied me for a long moment. Then she inclined her head, a gesture so slight that it was barely perceptible, but in Velithari culture, it carried the weight of a formal decree. "The trial will continue," she said. "But regardless of the outcome, I want to discuss a broader arrangement with your coalition. A military consultation framework. Your presence here has demonstrated something that our intelligence reports failed to capture." She paused. "Humans do not fight the way we expected. You do not fight the way anyone should be expected to fight. That is either very dangerous or very valuable, and I would prefer to determine which, before the next crisis forces the question." I nodded. "I will relay your interest to my government." "Do more than relay it. Advocate for it." "Yes, Empress." The guards escorted me back to the arena. The galleries had filled even further during the recess, word spreading through the station and beyond that something unprecedented was happening in the Kytheri sphere. The harmonic tone of the crowd had changed. It was deeper now, more complex, carrying undertones that even my trained ear could not fully separate. The Velithari in those galleries were no longer watching entertainment. They were watching history, and they knew it. Round 5. The Unbound. No rules, no preset objectives, full arena, all terrain configurations active simultaneously, all previous round resources and positions carrying forward. This was the round that tested everything at once: the ability to fight, to build, to move, to adapt, to strategize, all in a single continuous engagement, without pause or respite. It was the round that separated champions from competitors, the round where raw capability mattered less than the ability to synthesize every skill into a unified whole. The starting tone sounded, and Vylith came at me like a force of nature. But it was not the same Vylith who had fought in round 3. This was someone different, someone evolved. She moved with the same speed and power, but her tactics had transformed completely. She used asymmetric positioning, approaching from angles that no Velethari combat manual would recommend. She created deliberate vulnerabilities in her guard, then used those vulnerabilities as bait, redirecting my counters into positions where she held advantage. She read the terrain shifts before they happened, anticipating the grid reconfiguration with an accuracy that approached what I had demonstrated in round 1. She was using my tactics, not copying them, integrating them, filtering them through her own capabilities and her own understanding, and producing something that was neither mine nor hers, but a synthesis that should not have existed. A new martial philosophy born in the space between two civilizations, created in real time by a mind that refused to accept the boundaries of its own tradition. I pushed back with everything I had. I used Velethari positional doctrine, the classical frameworks I had spent 11 years studying, but I ran them through the lens of human unpredictability, the lateral thinking and improvisational instinct that made human combat doctrine so difficult for other species to anticipate. I feinted with strategies that looked like textbook Velethari approaches, but pivoted at the last instant into something alien, something that broke the expected pattern and created openings that should not have been there. We fought across the full arena, not just physically, but strategically, building and dismantling positions, claiming and contesting resources, reading each other's movements, and counter-moving in real time. The pace was relentless. My body was burning through its reserves. Muscles were screaming. Lungs were pulling oxygen that the arena's slightly thinner atmosphere did not provide in sufficient quantity. My left arm had not fully recovered from the round 3 shoulder strike, and every impact on that side sent a jolt of pain through my torso that narrowed my vision for a fraction of a second. She was pushing me harder than I had been pushed since a night in the Kepler corridor 6 years ago, when everything had gone wrong, and the only thing between me and failure was the absolute refusal to stop thinking. That night had cost me 3 ribs and a month of recovery. This arena was costing me something different, something I could not name, but could feel draining away with every exchange. She executed a maneuver in the final minutes that I will remember for the rest of my life. A combination that began with a classic Velethari forearm engagement pattern, the kind I had seen in hundreds of recorded matches, but transitioned mid-sequence into an adaptive response framework she had built from watching me throughout the match. The transition was seamless, the execution was beautiful. It was a technique that existed nowhere in any database, any manual, any tactical archive in any civilization. She had created it in the heat of combat, synthesized from 2 completely different combat traditions, and she executed it with the precision of someone who had practiced it for years, even though it had existed for less than an hour. I barely survived it. My response was instinct and calculation fused into a single desperate moment, a counter that was equally improvised, equally unprecedented, a fusion of everything I knew filtered through 30 years of studying how different minds approached the same fundamental problems. We traded positions 4 times in 90 seconds, each exchange more complex than the last, each adaptation feeding into the next, each moment pushing both of us further beyond what either of our traditions said was possible. The final tone sounded. I stood on one side of the arena, breathing so hard that my vision was tunneling at the edges. Sweat had soaked through what remained of my gray jacket. My hands were trembling. Every muscle in my body was threatening to cramp simultaneously. Vylith stood on the other side, all 4 arms trembling with exertion, her skin cycling through colors so rapidly that it looked like liquid light moving across her body. She was breathing hard through both her primary and secondary respiratory passages, a sign of extreme physical expenditure that most Velethari considered undignified. She did not appear to care about dignity at this moment. The adjudication system calculated the final score. The holographic display above the arena updated, and the galleries leaned forward as one, thousands of Velithari straining to see the numbers. I won, by the smallest margin in recorded trial history, a difference so slight that the adjudication system had to extend its calculation cycle to confirm the result. A difference measured in fractions of points that could have gone the other way if a single exchange in any round had landed differently. If her fourth round adaptation had come 90 seconds earlier. If my round 3 nerve strikes had been a centimeter off target. If any one of 100 moments had tilted the other direction. Violith stood across the arena from me. All 4 fists were clenched. Her skin had settled into a steady, deep silver that I had not seen from her before, a color that was not in any emotional signaling reference I had studied. Something new, something that might not have had a reason to exist before today. She did not look defeated. The word defeat did not belong anywhere near the expression on her face. She looked ignited. The arena was silent for 3 full seconds after the result was announced. 3 seconds of absolute stillness from thousands of Velithari who had come to watch their princess demonstrate the superiority of their civilization and had instead witnessed something that none of them had a framework to process. Then Violith did something that had never happened in the recorded history of the Calith trials. She walked across the arena floor, not to her preparation area, not to the exit, across the full distance of the arena, directly toward me, her 4 arms at her sides, her stride unhurried, her silver skin glowing with that strange new color that had no name in any reference text I had read. She stopped in front of me, close enough that I had to look up to meet her eyes. She extended her primary right hand. "Teach me," she said. The galleries erupted, not in laughter this time, not in the harmonics of amusement or satisfaction. In something that had no ready translation, a sound that was part shock and part something deeper, the collective processing of a civilization watching one of its most fundamental assumptions get challenged by its own princess. A princess of the ascendancy, heir to 11,000 years of military supremacy, was asking a representative of the youngest spacefaring species in the sector to be her instructor. The General, Korthon, murmured something to the Empress. I could not hear the words, but I saw the shape of them on his lips, and the shape looked something like, perhaps this was the point all along. I took her hand. Her grip was firm and warm, her skin smooth and faintly vibrating with the bioluminescent energy that ran beneath the surface. Up close, the new silver color had depth to it, layers of light shifting beneath the surface like currents in deep water. "You do not need a teacher," I said. "You adapted to a completely alien tactical framework in real time, and nearly defeated the person who brought it. In the final round, you created techniques that I could not have created myself. That is not a student's capability. That is a peer's." She processed this. I watched the word land, watched it move through her understanding, and settle into a place where it fit alongside everything else she had experienced today. Her skin shifted, slowly, from silver to a pale, luminous blue that pulsed once and then held steady. "No one has ever called me a peer," she said quietly. "Champion, prodigy, heir, weapon, asset." She paused, and something shifted behind her eyes, something old and tired that had been carrying weight for a long time, never equal. Then they were not paying attention. The formal treaty ceremony took place 2 hours later in the imperial court. The galleries were full again, but the atmosphere was entirely different from my first visit. The amused contempt of the previous day was gone completely. In its place was something cautious and complex. The collective processing of a civilization that had just watched its assumptions about a younger species get dismantled in 5 rounds by a single person in a gray jacket. Per trial law, the treaty was renewed on Earth's terms. The document was presented to me for final review before ratification, and I read through it carefully, every clause, every subclause, every provision and contingency and enforcement mechanism. Then I picked up the stylus and modified 2 sections. The Velithari delegation stiffened. Korthon stepped forward, his expression sharp. Changing terms after a trial victory was rare but not unprecedented, and it was always done to increase the victor's advantage. Every historical precedent pointed in one direction. the winner takes more. I made the terms more equitable. I reduced 2 extraction quotas that Earth had originally demanded, bringing them closer to what was fair for both parties, rather than what was maximally advantageous for Earth. I adjusted a territorial access clause to include reciprocal rights that the original treaty had not provided to the Velithari. The changes were small in practical terms, but enormous in symbolic weight. Why? Korthon asked. A treaty built on humiliation does not last, I said. The Valaran Accord failed the first time because it was drafted as charity from a superior civilization to an inferior one. That dynamic poisoned it from the beginning. This version needs to be built on something stronger. I set down the stylus. I would rather come back here as a guest than as an opponent. The Empress watched me modify the document. She said nothing, but I saw the faintest shift in her skin color. A brief flicker of pale gold that I had learned from my studies indicated something the Velithari rarely felt toward outsiders. Approval. Violet stood at the edge of the ceremony, watching. Her expression was one I could not fully read, and I had become reasonably skilled at reading Velithari expressions over the past 2 days. There were layers to it that I did not have the cultural context to separate. I caught fragments: respect, curiosity, something analytical, and something that was not analytical at all. After the ceremony, in a private chamber overlooking the observation galleries of the now empty Catheri sphere, Violet asked me the question she had been holding since round 3. Not what I was. She had asked that already, and received an answer she did not accept. This time, the question was different. Why are you what you are? She said. Why does your species pour this much energy into understanding how other civilizations fight? You studied our doctrine for 11 years. 11 years of your short lives, spent learning the combat theory of a species you had no reason to believe you would ever face in a trial. Not for assignment. Not for advantage. Compulsively. Why? I thought about the question for a long time. She waited. The Velithari were patient when they chose to be, and she had apparently decided that this moment warranted patience. Because we are afraid, I said. All the time. Every moment of every day. We are small. We are short-lived. We are fragile. We break easily. We die easily. We know this. Every human who has ever lived has known this on some fundamental level, that we cannot escape, no matter how many stars we reach or how many civilizations we meet. I paused, looking out at the empty arena where we had spent the day pushing each other beyond what either of us had thought possible. So we learn everything. From everyone, constantly. Not because we want to dominate, not because we want to conquer, because we never feel safe enough to stop. Every human who ever picked up a weapon did it because something in our evolutionary history whispered that the dark was full of things that wanted to eat us. That whisper never stopped. We just got better at answering it. Violet was quiet for a long time. The bioluminescent patterns on her skin slowed to a gentle, rhythmic pulse that I had never seen in any reference material. It might have been contemplation. It might have been sadness. It might have been something that the Velithari emotional vocabulary had not yet named, something that only exists when you understand, for the first time, that another being's entire existence is shaped by a fear you have never felt. That is the saddest war doctrine I have ever heard, she said. I almost laughed. Almost, yeah, I agreed. It really is. The silence that followed was comfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had spent a day trying to outthink each other and had arrived at a place of mutual understanding that existed beyond competition, beyond species, beyond the 11,000-year gap between our civilizations. I am going to redesign the Ascendancy's tactical curriculum, Violet said. The entire structure, from foundational training through advanced doctrine. I am going to incorporate adaptive methodology, not as a supplement, but as a core principle. The synthesis I created in the final round, that was not a trick or a desperation move. It was a glimpse of something that could transform how my civilization approaches strategic thinking for the next 1,000 years. I believe that, I said, and I meant it. I want to visit your military academies. I want to understand how a species that has been spacefaring for less than 3 centuries developed strategic instincts that rival civilizations 10,000 years older. I want to see how you train, how you think, How you take the fear you described and turn it into the thing I saw today. You would be welcome. Anytime. She studied me. You mean that? I mean everything I say. It is one of my many character flaws. The corner of her mouth moved in what I had learned was the Velithari equivalent of a smile. A subtle thing, barely visible, but unmistakably real. The Empress granted me a formal title before my departure, the first ever given to a non-Velithari in the history of the Ascendancy. The ceremony was brief and conducted in the old formal dialect that even most Velithari no longer used fluently. The title translated, roughly and imperfectly, as the one who teaches by fighting. It was traditionally given to warriors who had elevated their opponents through combat, rather than merely defeating them. The last time it had been granted was over 600 years ago, and it had never been given to anyone outside the Velithari species. I accepted it with genuine gratitude, not because I valued titles, but because I understood what it cost the Empress to give it. 11,000 years of tradition bent, just slightly, to acknowledge that something had changed, that the universe was wider than the Ascendancy had allowed itself to believe, and that wisdom could come from unexpected places. At the docking bay, Violeth met me one final time. She was alone. No guards, no attachés, no ceremonial escort. Just her, standing by the shuttle entrance in simple clothing, her skin cycling through soft, slow patterns of blue and silver that looked almost peaceful. The bioluminescent veins in the docking bay walls pulsed around her, and for a moment, she looked like part of the station itself, a living piece of the civilization she was about to reshape. "The notebook in your case," she said, "the list of names with mine at the bottom. I saw you looking at it last night through the surveillance feed you deliberately left active." I raised an eyebrow. "You were monitoring me." Obviously. What was the list? I could have deflected. I could have told her it was classified, or personal, or irrelevant. But she had earned honesty. She had earned it in the arena, in the way she fought, in the way she adapted, in the way she tore down her own defenses and rebuilt them from nothing, because the truth was more important to her than the comfort of what she already knew. "It is a list of every opponent I have studied who I believed could beat me if they ever adapted beyond their own training," I said. "Every name on that list was someone whose raw capability exceeded my own. Someone who would have defeated me if they had been willing to abandon their assumptions and fight without the safety of doctrine. Every name was crossed out, not because I defeated them easily, but because when I finally faced them, they could not make that leap. They were trapped inside their own excellence. Their training was so good that it became a cage, and they could not break free of it, even when breaking free was the only path to victory. And my name is not crossed out. No, because I adapted. Because you adapted, in real time, under pressure, against a methodology you had never encountered, developed by a species you had dismissed as inferior before the match began. You did not just adjust your tactics. You fundamentally restructured your entire approach to combat during a live match, created a synthesis that has never existed in any civilization's tactical library, and you executed it with the precision of a master. I met her eyes. You are the only name on that list that I could not cross out. You are the only opponent I have faced in 30 years who I believe could have won." She stared at me. Her skin went still, completely still, the same response I had seen from the Empress when she first read my file. Total emotional suppression, because the input was too significant to process in the moment. The bioluminescent patterns froze in place, and for a few seconds she was a statue carved from silver and deep blue, motionless, except for the slow rise and fall of her breathing. "You are saying I could have won," she said. I shook my head. "I am saying next time, you probably will." The stillness held for 3 more seconds. Then her skin erupted in a blaze of gold and white that I had never seen from any Velithari, a color combination that was not in any emotional reference, any cultural database, any xenopsychological study I had ever read. It was something new, something that perhaps had never had a reason to exist before this moment. A color for an emotion that had no name, because no Velithari had ever felt it before today. She extended her hand again. I took it. "Next time," she said. "Next time, I boarded the shuttle alone. The doors closed, and the docking bay fell away as the craft lifted and accelerated through the departure shaft. I watched the orbital palace shrink in the viewport until it was just another point of light among the stars, indistinguishable from any other, holding 11,000 years of history and one afternoon that had changed its trajectory. I opened the notebook. I turned to Violet's page, to the entry that remained uncrossed, and I picked up my pen. I did not cross out her name. Instead, beneath it, I wrote a single annotation in the small, precise handwriting that filled every page of this worn, cracked, endlessly rewritten book. Not an opponent, an evolution. I closed the notebook. I placed it back in the case. I leaned back in the oversized seat, the one designed for 12 people who had never come, and closed my eyes. For the first time in 3 days, I slept. Deep and dreamless and complete. The kind of sleep that only comes when every part of your mind has been used to its absolute limit, and there is nothing left to think about, nothing left to calculate, nothing left to prepare for. Somewhere behind me, in an orbital palace that had stood for 11,000 years, a princess was already rewriting the rules of an empire. She would visit Earth's academies. She would challenge every assumption her civilization held about combat, about strategy, about the nature of strength itself. She would take what she had learned in the Kytheri sphere and build something from it that neither of our species could have created alone. The synthesis she had forged in those final minutes of the trial would become the foundation of a new doctrine, one that blended the precision and depth of Velithari tradition with the desperate, creative adaptability of a species that had never stopped being afraid of the dark. Earth did not know what it had started. My government had sent me to this assignment because nobody else wanted it, because the Velithari Treaty was a low-priority item on a long list of things that more important people were too busy for. They had accidentally deployed their most unconventional strategic mind into a situation that demanded exactly that. And the result was not just a renewed treaty, but the beginning of something that would reshape the military and diplomatic relationship between two civilizations for generations to come. I smiled in my sleep. We never knew what we started. That was the human way. We stumbled into things, survived them through stubbornness and fear, and the compulsive need to understand everything around us. And then we looked back years later and realized that the accident had been the most important thing we ever did. We did not plan our greatest moments. We tripped over them in the dark, picked ourselves up, and kept walking, because walking was all we knew how to do, and stopping was never really an option for a species that evolved on a world that was trying to kill it every single day. The shuttle carried me home through the silent dark between stars, and behind me, the future was already changing.